How courts define fundamental rights. In modern constitutional systems, courts do not determine fundamental rights purely by philosophy. They use legal tests grounded in constitutional text, precedent, and doctrine. Let's use the United States as a working model because it's one of the most developed constitutional republics. 1. Constitutional source courts first ask, is this right explicitly mentioned in the Constitution? Examples explicitly protected: freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches. If explicitly listed, e.g. in the Bill of Rights, courts treat them as fundamental. Number 2. Implicit or unenumerated rights. Some rights are not written word for word, but have been recognized as fundamental. Courts typically use tests such as, is the claimed right deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions? Is it implicit in the concept of ordered liberty? These standards have been articulated in Supreme Court jurisprudence. This is where judicial philosophy matters. Originalists emphasize historical grounding. Living constitutionalists emphasize evolving standards. Fundamental rights trigger strict scrutiny, the highest level of judicial review. The government must show 1. A compelling interest. 2. The law is narrowly tailored. 3. It uses the least restrictive means. If it fails that test, the law is struck down. So in practice, fundamental rights equals rights courts treat as requiring the highest protection against government interference. 2. Limits of jurisdiction in constitutional democracies. Now we separate rights from jurisdiction. Rights concern what government may do. Jurisdiction concerns where and over whom government has authority. In constitutional democracies, 1. Subject matter jurisdiction. Courts can only hear certain types of cases. For example, federal courts hear federal questions and diversity cases. State courts handle most criminal and civil matters. If a court lacks subject matter jurisdiction, it cannot rule, even if it wants to. 2. Personal jurisdiction. A court must have authority over the person or entity involved. This requires territorial connection, minimum contacts with the jurisdiction. Without sufficient connection, jurisdiction fails. #3. Territorial jurisdiction. Government authority generally applies within defined borders. Outside those borders, jurisdiction becomes limited or requires special justification, treaties, extraterritorial statutes, etc. 4. Constitutional limits on jurisdiction. Even if jurisdiction exists, constitutional rights limit how power is exercised. For example, due process limits arbitrary state action. Equal protection limits discriminatory laws. Separation of powers limits institutional overreach. So jurisdiction answers, can this court act? Rights answer, even if it can act, are there limits? 3. Constitutional democracies versus constitutional republics. These terms overlap, but let's clarify. A constitutional democracy has elected representatives, operates under a constitution, allows majority rule within constitutional constraints. A constitutional republic emphasizes rule of law, governs through representatives, protects minority rights against majority will, anchors authority in a constitutional framework. In practice, many modern states, including the U.S., are both. The difference is philosophical emphasis. Democracy stresses popular sovereignty. Republic stresses constitutional restraint and rule of law. 4. How courts define rights within a constitutional republic. In a constitutional republic, 1. Sovereignty ultimately resides in the people, theory. 2. Government power is delegated. 3. Courts interpret the scope of delegation. Courts do not create rights from nothing. They interpret constitutional text, amendments, precedent, legislative enactments. However, judicial interpretation significantly shapes how rights operate in reality. For example, the text may be brief. Interpretation expands or narrows application. Thus, rights in practice are text plus interpretation, precedent. #V, the tension between natural law and legal positivism. Here is the deeper structural divide. Natural law theory. Rights exist prior to government. Government must conform to them. Legal positivism. Rights exist because recognized legal authority defines and enforces them. Modern constitutional courts function within a positivist framework, even when referencing natural rights language. Courts cannot enforce a right that has no constitutional or statutory basis recognized within their system. VI. Key structural distinction. Concept question. Fundamental rights. What protections limit government power? Jurisdiction. When and over whom can government exercise authority? Constitutional democracy. How majority rule operates under law. Constitutional republic. How law restrains majority rule. A crucial clarification. No modern constitutional court recognizes individual personal sovereignty as independent from political sovereignty within territorial jurisdiction. In modern systems, individuals are rights-bearing persons. Governments are sovereign entities. Courts mediate the boundary. The court's authority flows from constitutional structure, not from philosophical natural law directly. Veit, where confusion often arises. People sometimes assume, if a right is natural, it automatically overrides statutory law. In practice, courts enforce what is constitutionally cognizable. A moral claim must be translated into constitutional doctrine to be judicially enforceable. Summary in plain terms. Courts define fundamental rights through constitutional text, historical tradition, judicial tests, precedent. Jurisdiction is limited by territory, subject matter, due process, institutional boundaries. Constitutional democracies allow majority rule. Constitutional republics restrain majority rule through law. Modern courts operate within structured legal authority, not abstract philosophical sovereignty.